Hi guys, so today I wanted to do a short video talking about basically my thoughts on the upcoming UK general election. So, as many of you might know, on June the 8th, there'll be another general election in the UK to elect a new government. So, first, I wanted to give a bit of a kind of historical background. So first, I wanted to just explain what's called the post-war consensus, which existed in British politics from immediately after the Second World War until the mid to late 1970s. The post-war consensus refers to the fact that during the period that I just referred to, there was broad agreement between the opposing parties that were represented in the British Parliament, so I guess the Labour Party and the Conservative Party being the main players. There are obviously small differences between the parties, but they broadly agreed on things like higher taxes, a strong welfare state, and nationalisation of major industries. So followed a more Keynesian economic system, so using government spending to avoid recessions and drive growth. Now, this consensus was pretty much shattered in the late 1970s with the coming to power of Margaret Thatcher around the same time as the election of Ronald Reagan in the US, who in many ways shared a lot of her philosophy. And so this basically led to an escalation of so-called neoliberal policies, which are influenced by economists such as Milton Friedman. And basically this led to a remodelling of society, basically allow the free market to do its job with as little government intervention as possible. And so this led to privatisation of public services such as energy industry and public transport. Obviously that's gone kind of disastrously, given that we now have the most expensive railway network in Europe. And it also saw the crippling of trade unions with lots of restrictions imposed on strikes. And it also saw the top rate of income tax cut from 83% to 40%. And so the Conservatives held sway for 18 years. And when Labour finally returned to power in 1997 under Tony Blair, they didn't actually really try to reverse many of these changes that had been made by Thatcher. So they basically accepted a lot of her ideas. So, for instance, they didn't renationalise any of the industries that had been privatised under Thatcher and Major, and they continued to basically keep trade unions at arm's length. So they didn't really try to strengthen their role to any significant degree. You saw the expansion of private finance initiatives where private companies would finance construction of schools and hospitals, and then they'd lease them back to the taxpayer. That seemed like a great idea at the time, but now it's meant that NHS trusts now owe about £80 billion in loans to these private companies. So that's not to say that the Blair and then later Brown new Labour governments were universally bad. They did introduce some things which I'd given credit for, such as the minimum wage, the Sure Start programme, which improved childcare, and they also started the process of devolution of responsibilities to like Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish local governments, which I broadly support. So I think decisions should be taken on as a local scale as possible, because I generally think that those living in certain communities are best placed to make those decisions affecting their communities. But overall, they didn't really mount any challenge to this kind of neoliberal orthodoxy, and kind of cemented the view that there's no alternative to these policies. And also, I shouldn't forget to mention that they also made a number of disastrous foreign interventions. For instance, the Iraq War, which saw huge civilian death tolls. And then since 2010, we've been governed by the Conservative Party again. So, firstly, in a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats from 2010 to 2015, and then a Tory majority government for the last 2 years. I'd say that's been even more of a disaster than the new Labour government. We've seen really cruel sanctions imposed on benefit claimants, which has driven many people to suicide, and it's caused a lot of misery for the most vulnerable members in society, as is depicted wonderfully in Ken Loach's film I, Daniel Blake, which I'd highly recommend if you haven't seen. They've overseen further privatisation, so Royal Mail has been privatised, and they've also had a really terrible environmental record. They've scrapped support for solar and wind energy, but they've also given the green light to hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which is a really environmentally disastrous method of generating energy. And these economic policies, which have been followed by the Conservative government, which are commonly described as austerity measures, they've had a terrible impact on some of the most vulnerable people in society. We've seen rises in homelessness and child poverty, and huge numbers of people have had to turn to food banks because they simply haven't been able to afford to eat, which is a really terrible thing to be happening in what's one of the richest countries in the world. So in short, I'd say that 30 or so years of neoliberalism has eroded lots of the hard-fought rights that workers have battled for over the centuries. It's also led to transferring of lots of public assets into the hands of private corporations with often disastrous effects, and it's led to wages for working class people stagnating in many cases and even falling in recent years. So unfortunately, this whole idea of trickle-down economics, where sure the richest might get more wealthy, but it also deliver benefits to those lower down the ladder, has proved to be a complete joke. Those at the top have definitely benefited, but those at the bottom really haven't seen any of the benefits of these policies. And in fact, their quality of living is reduced in many cases. So that brings us neatly on to this year's general election, where for the first time in maybe 30 years, the British people actually have what I'd call a genuine choice, in that a couple of years ago, Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, and this was on a platform which was markedly to the left of what's been the dominant ideology for the last 30 years or so. So as some of you may know, a few days ago, a draft copy of the 2017 Labour election manifesto was leaked to the media. So there were a number of promising things from my point of view. So, for instance, Labour have promised to renationalise the railways, and they've promised to scrap tuition fees for higher education and introduce national education service where people could basically engage in lifelong learning programmes. And they'd also ensure the NHS, which is one of our greatest assets, but has sadly been run into the ground over recent years by both Labour and Conservative governments. And they'd also support trade unions and try to bolster their rights. Brexit negotiations are a very important topic to consider at this moment in time, and what Labour have said they'll do is they'll guarantee the right sort of EU citizens living in Britain, which is, I think, a really important thing, because at the moment a lot of migrants are facing a lot of uncertainty, but they don't know if they'll be allowed to stay in the country. They've also put forward numerous policies to address the climate crisis, so by letting communities take control of their own energy supplies rather than having it in the hands of the big six energy companies, pledged to invest in renewable energies and entrench the environmental protections that are currently mandated by the EU to UK law. So even once we leave the EU, those protections will still be in place. And it seems to me that in the right-wing media, there's good contention that Labour in some kind of cuckoo land, that they're just creating money out of nowhere and suggesting policies they couldn't possibly pay for. But what they've actually said is that they'll raise taxes on the highest earners in corporations and ensure that these multinational corporations who are making vast amounts of money, like for instance Amazon and Starbucks, ensure they pay a fair amount of tax. But what I do think is interesting is that, so even though, as I said, in the manifesto they have accounted for where the money will come from, it's interesting that there always seems to be money to fight foreign wars or to bail out banks, things like that. But suddenly, whenever someone puts forward a policy that will actually benefit the ordinary people in society, suddenly everyone's asking, where are you going to get the money from? It seems a little silly to me. You might argue that, with all these announcements Theresa May's putting out about how she's going to deliver a workplace revolution and give workers all these rights, then working people should vote for the Tory party. But I suggest that it'd be better to judge whether that's likely to happen not on the rhetoric but on her record. And in fact, Theresa May's voted very much against the interests of the working class. So she voted in favour of a trade union act which restricted the right to strike. She's voted to retain the cap on public sector pay, and she's backed the introduction of fees that workers have to pay if they want to bring their employers to tribunals. So these aren't very worker-friendly measures. And also, if you look at her record as Home Secretary, she proposed a snoopers charter, which has allowed the government to spy on online activity. She wrongly deported maybe up to 50,000 international students, and she also kind of stoked the flame of anti-immigrant sentiment, which has sadly seen an upturn in recent years by introducing an advertising campaign basically telling immigrants to go home. And something that's really important to me, which maybe hasn't been getting as much attention as it should do in my view, is that she's also a vocal supporter of fox hunting, which I think is just one of the most horrific practices that goes on in this country. Obviously, as a vegan, I have very strong views on this matter, and even though the current hunting ban isn't very well enforced, people do still go out and hunt for foxes fairly openly without really any recrimination. I definitely think the complete repeal of this ban would be a major step backwards, and I really hope this won't come to pass. So in contrast, if you look at Jeremy Corbyn's voting record, he's got a long history of supporting progressive causes such as gay rights and the fight against climate change, and championing the rights of benefit claimants, fighting against the hunting ban and the badger cull, and also he's generally favoured a non-interventionist foreign policy, which I think would be a wise route for this country to go down. But that doesn't mean, of course, just completely ignoring the plights of people who might be fleeing from war-torn countries or suffering repression in their own countries. But I think what would be a much better approach would be to offer humanitarian assistance to those who are being impacted. So that means taking on more refugees, because at the moment we've taken a very small number of refugees. But having said all this, I think it's important to be realistic and realise that, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is not going to deliver a socialist utopia. Probably won't go far enough on certain really pressing issues such as climate change. We're not going to get fully luxury automated communism. It will basically just be a slightly nicer version of capitalism. But I still think it's worth supporting the party, because I feel that it will improve the lives of some of the most vulnerable in society who are really struggling at the moment. And I mean, I could sit here and say, well, I'm not going to vote for a party that doesn't exactly meet my ideological views and maintain some kind of personal purity. But I think as someone who's privileged enough to not be suffering quite as much as some of the most vulnerable in society, I think I should be prepared to sacrifice my own personal purity if it means protecting those lower down the ladder. But obviously, politics doesn't end after June the 8th. So it's not as though if the Labour government did come to power, I just put up my feet and that's the job done. So what the task for us on the left would only just be beginning, and it'd be important that we continue to ensure that the government heads in a progressive direction and doesn't return more to the centre ground. But I really do think it's important that we seize this opportunity, because if we don't take this one, then we could be waiting another 30 years. And unfortunately, with things like climate change, we haven't got another 30 years to wait. So basically, that's my 2 cents on the matter. I would be interested to hear what you will think of it, because I don't claim to be the font of all or any knowledge on these matters, and I'd welcome any alternative views. But so I'd highly recommend, if you are a citizen of the UK, that you are voted for the Labour Party, where Labour have a good chance of winning. It might be, for instance, in Brighton, probably better voting for the Green Party. And there might be other places where you're better off voting for Plaid Cymru or the Scottish National Party. I think whatever we can do to get the Tories out is worth doing. So if that means tactical voting in some places, I would also advocate that. But so that's my view on the matter, and I hope you enjoyed this first video of mine. And let me know if you have any suggestions for anything else you'd like me to talk about.